In this lecture, we're going to talk about the 5 components of leadership. The 5 components of leadership are a good framework for understanding leadership, and they are based on the book of that name by Robert McManus and Gamma Perruci, published by Routledge in 2015. We start with our understanding of leadership based on the conception of the two words leader and leadership. In much early literature, these two words were interchangeable. Direct associations between the two positions of authority, or the position of authority, and the idea of leadership were simultaneous. Leadership was often a reference to positional power. The connection between leadership was often focused initially on traits such as courage, passion, vision. This, referred to as trait theory, was a direct outgrowth of the 19th century historical basis of leadership from the great man theory in history. Great leaders can teach us much about the nature of leadership, complex human phenomena, but modern views associate leadership more with a process made up of individual components, each contributing to the whole picture. Rather than spotlight on the leader, the emphasis is to widen the glow to encompass the whole landscape. And that's really what the 5 components do. They look at leadership as a process instead of the heroic ability of leaders. Other components become equally important in our understanding of how leadership works. So the 5 components consist of leaders, followers, goals, environmental context, and cultural context. Leaders play an essential role in providing the energy and vision that guide followers' actions. Larger-than-life image of the leader discourages people from taking on the leadership role. Demystifying this role, other ways for leaders to contribute to leadership process has now become one of the major focal points. The first step to demystifying the image of the leader is to conceptualize leadership as a separate category that exists beyond the leader. One way is to look at the role of followers and the role that followers play in the leadership process. It makes little sense to focus on leaders without considering followers. The traditional conception is to look at followers as subordinates. In reality, we live in a very different environment. Modern form of followership as a major consideration in the whole process of leadership. Followers are now empowered by more education, better technology, more information, and enhanced communication abilities. This allows followers to play a more active role in negotiating their space in the leadership process. There is a need to recognize power and influence of followers in this relationship. Does not mean being passive, powerless, disengaged. Leader-follower roles are constantly being negotiated again and again. Followers are partners in the pursuit of leadership, and that leads us to the third component, and that's goals. Leaders and followers work together to develop goals. A great leadership theorist, James McGregor Burns, who first wrote about the idea of transactional versus transformational leadership, is a good place to start in looking at goals. Transactional leaders and followers have an exchange relationship, and they play a part each in this exchange relationship, for example, a pay raise for higher productivity. Transformational leaders is a little bit beyond just the transactional approach. In this case, leaders and followers work together to elevate themselves to higher levels of motivation and morality. This work toward a common goal assumes that leaders are part, as well as followers, are part of the overall goals of the organization. And so the leaders shape the goals of the organization, influence and power. They set the agenda, but followers shape the legitimacy of the goals, and then can reject the leader's vision and goals, and sometimes these divisions can be disastrous. So the relationship between leaders and followers in the pursuit of goals doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens because and as part of situational elements. And this leads us to the fourth part of the model of the 5 components, and that's the environmental context. Leaders find themselves captive to certain situations. Otherwise, they would be able to have, we would all be able to have a field manual or instructions. Leadership could be programmable, but leadership is not. It is based, it's not replicable based on replicable formulas. It is situational. And leaders' success in one situation can be quite different in other circumstances. Situational leadership theories include ideas such as contingency theory of Fielder, Perruci and Blanchard, behavioral models, the idea of theory X and theory Y. We'll talk a lot more about later in the course. And then action-centered task and power structure elements of environmental context. Finally, leadership cannot be divorced from environmental context, but we also can't discount the importance of values, norms, and culture in shaping leaders and followers in their worldviews. And so the operational definition that we'll work under for the purpose of defining leadership is that leadership is a process by which leaders and followers develop a relationship and work together toward a goal or goals within the context of an environment that is shaped by cultural values and norms. There are a host of other definitions by some very outstanding leadership theorists, of course, that will enter into the context of our discussion. Very simply stated, leadership is an art of mobilizing others to want to struggle for shared aspirations. That's a very goal-centered element of leadership. Ron Heifetz, who we'll talk about late in the course with adaptive leadership, calls leadership a process that's transacted between leaders and followers. It's not linear, it's interactive. Most simply, it's how an individual influences a group. Influence is the sine qua non of leadership, according to Heifetz. James McGregor Burns, who we talked about as the father of transformational leadership, says simply that leadership is making followers do what they ordinarily would not do. And so leadership really is more focused on the concept of purposeful interaction. It's the central intellectual focus of what we'll discuss as we discuss leadership in leadership studies revolves around human beings and their purposeful interaction and how leadership basically invites debates about ethics, power relations, and the choices that are made through these purposeful interactions, the clarification of the intent of the leader. And leaders and followers bring these values to the relationships that guide their behavior. So it's the intentionality that becomes the expression of these values. So in leadership, the distinction between emotion and action, with leaders and followers engaging in this relationship that involves action with implicit and explicit intent. And so it is a very human-oriented business, and therefore it is not a science, it's an art. As humans interact, they form social structures which define power relationships. In leadership, we're concerned with the way individuals come together and develop these relationships with a purpose in mind. We agree or we argue whether that purpose is ethical or not, or who should ultimately have the decision-making authority. But the point of it all is that purposeful interaction. That's the overarching language that organizes our thinking about leadership. And so as we look at the history of leadership studies and the leadership that we're going to be discussing here, going back to the early ideas of the great man theory and the early ideas that it's all about the leader and the traits that the leader has, that eventually gave way to much of the behaviorist theories in the advent of early sociological and psychological studies in the early 20th century. And that leadership in the behaviorist model really became focused on situational elements of leadership. But then, as leadership became identified as more of a process, you begin to see this notion of followership, servant leadership, and cultural elements of Western versus non-Western. And then, of course, this idea of transformational leadership and adaptive leadership, which are two of the most modern conceptions of leadership study and leadership theory. All things that we have to look forward to as we move ahead in this course.